We are very excited to welcome back Shereen Boyer. Shereen this is actually like the fourth time she's spoken to us. So she has a BA in economics from the College of Worcester. She has an MBA in finance and business from the University of Chicago. And she's a certified financial planner with over 30 years experience in the finance industry. I'm going to bring Julie and Shereen up and we will get started. Last time Shereen was here, the crowd was basically asking her to start a Substack and do all kinds of videos on the economy. So we are really glad to bring her back. I am also going to drop in the chat the link to the last time she came and did a talk about the economy, because during that chat we talked a lot about inflation. We talked about the budget and the deficit. We talked about taxes. So we are not going to repeat those questions tonight. So if you missed the first one, please go watch the video. We're going to try to cover new topics because there is a lot to talk about with the economy. So anyways, we will go ahead and get started. And I think, Julie, you have the first question.
Oh, sorry about that. I was looking for links. Let's see there, not paying attention. Shereen, thank you so much for being here tonight. First question right out the bat that I really want to explain. How do tariffs work? And how would Trump's plan impact the economy?
That's a great question. And by the way, thank you both. Hi, Julie. Hi, Julie. So we're hearing a lot about Trump saying he's a tariff man and we're going to impose tariffs and that's going to be the solution to everything. A tariff basically acts like a tax. And so any good that comes into the United States, they're going to charge a tariff. So for example, Trump said that any car made in Mexico and brought into the US, which with NAFTA has been happening across the border a number of times, will have 100% tariff. So if a car cost $40,000, it will now cost the consumer closer to $80,000. And it is paid by the US consumer. It is not paid. It is absolutely untrue. There's no evidence to support the fact that it's paid by the other country. This is kind of like Trump and Mexico will pay for the wall. They're not going to pay for the wall. They're not going to pay for the tariffs. You and I are going to pay for the tariffs. And what can happen here, so a tariff acts like a tax, and he's specifically talking about using tariffs in a broad way against, say, a whole industry or against a whole country. So he's talking about, with China, maybe put a 60% tariff on anything that comes into the US from China. So if your granddaughter wants a $10 doll, it's now $16. If there's a $100 play set, it's now $160. Okay, so it's directly a tax. The US government collects the money. But what's especially bad about this is it's presented in a way as if to say that we put the tariff on there and then it stops. And that's not true. It's like if you walk up to somebody and you slap them, they're going to slap you back. They're going to respond. And so if we put these tariffs on China as an example, we can expect that China would reciprocate. And so if we put a 60% tariff on China, China then reciprocates just for the sake of tonight. Let's say they put the same tariff on. That means US companies that sell goods in China, they're now going to be 60% more expensive for a Chinese citizen to purchase. That means those US companies sell less. When US companies sell less, people get laid off. When people get laid off, they don't pay tax. Tax revenue goes down, and it's a spiral. So tariffs act like a tax. Tariffs are paid. We would pay for the tariffs that are imposed, and they are anti-free trade. They are expensive. One note I just want to say that there is a time and a place for a tariff. And there's been a little bit of talk that Biden has kept in place one of the tariffs that Trump put on steel from China. And when a tariff can work, it's a surgical strike. It's not bomb everything. It's a surgical maneuver. So if the Chinese government was found to be, instead of having a company that's underwritten by the Chinese government compete against a US company, that wouldn't be fair. And so a tariff can even the playing field and be used to make it a more competitive and more equal kind of trade. That's not what Trump is talking about when he says, I'm a tariff man. That would be very expensive for all of us. We would likely see inflation reemerge. We would see the cost of goods go up. If this was prolonged and it got into a trade war, we could also see unemployment.
Wow.
I have to unmute. I'm sorry. There was some noise in the background and I muted. Thank you so much. And I was going to follow up with that, but are there some good reasons for tariffs? And you answered that question. So thank you so much. So we recently had an interest rate cut. And so we would love to know, like, what does that mean? What is the impact of that? And what do you say to people who are out there being like, this was political, this was to help Harris?
Great question. Great question. So we had interest rates cut by 0.5% about a week ago. And that is the first cut that we've had since in several years. Interest rates are set by the Federal Reserve, and Jerome Powell is the Fed chairman, and he was nominated by both Trump and Biden. And I mention that because both presidents saw him as a worthy and competent Fed chair. It is not a political position, nor should it be made to be a political position. The United States economy has recovered from the pandemic better than any other developed country in the world, bar none. We have come out of this the best. It's not to say that it hasn't been difficult, but when you shut down really the world, when you shut down trade, when we stay in our house for 12 months or 18 months, it takes a while for the global economy to get going. I think of the interest rate cuts a lot like if you have a patient in the hospital and they need oxygen. The Federal Reserve cuts interest rates and it provides oxygen to the economy, and it's trying to get it back to healthy. And so the 0% interest rates that we had for more than a decade were a result of the financial crisis in 08 and 09. And so coming out of the pandemic, for the reasons we talked about last time, inflation was over 9%. The Federal Reserve raises interest rates in order to slow the economy and bring inflation down. It taps down demand. And they've done an absolutely incredible job. Inflation, it's still persistent. There are reasons for that. We can talk about it more if you want. But inflation has come down from over 9% to under 3%. And they've engineered what many of you may have heard about, which is the soft landing, which is typically when you raise interest rates, you cause unemployment to go up. And they have been able to very carefully, over many, many months, raise interest rates without raising unemployment. And so this is not a political position. If Powell had wanted to help Biden, rates would have been cut last year and in the spring, because it takes several months for the effect of the interest rate cuts to be felt. You know that if you have a credit card and you're carrying debt and they cut the interest rates, you've got the month until your credit card closes out and then another month until it's due. So an interest rate cut in September is likely to have very little political benefit. It's just a misunderstanding of the relationship between the economy and interest rates.
Could you, since you mentioned inflation and that there was more to it, just go ahead and explain that? That would be helpful. I'm sure people are wondering.
So there are a lot of things that contribute to inflation. Certainly the pandemic was one of them, and the spending to get out of that contributed to it. The disruptions in the global supply chain, we were all looking for bikes in the summer of 21 and they weren't to be had. And if you could find a bike or you could find yeast or toilet paper, right, we were paying for that because the supply and demand was off. But if you take a look now in the grocery store, the single biggest item in the last year that is more expensive are eggs, and they're up about 28%. And the reason for that is the avian flu. Mm-hmm. Nearly 90 million chickens and turkeys have been killed in order to stop that from infecting the other birds. And when you have that many egg-producing chickens kind of come out of the mix, we have fewer eggs, but people still want their scrambled eggs. They still want to bake cookies. So demand is up. That will right itself over time, because what happens is it doesn't happen So you've got the bird flu. You have the birds put down to prevent it from getting into the food supply and causing sickness. They will have more chickens, but it takes 6 months, 12 months for the birds to be hatched and to grow. And so it's simply not right to draw all of the lines back to the pandemic or to policies. There are lots of things. Climate change, right? 70% of the orange crop was knocked out a few years ago. 75% of the cherry crop in northern Michigan. Well, if you like to drink orange juice, but there is 70% fewer oranges this year, the price is going to go up. And so when you think about this, I think it's helpful to think about it in a more holistic way, which is when you're trying to decide which party is going to be better for the economy, it's not a single policy. It's a policy that will deal with the deficit. It's a policy that is going to have food inspectors to try and catch mad cow and bird flu early. It's an administration that's going to try and address the long-term effects of climate change that will inevitably impact grains and birds and fruit. And so it's all those sorts of things that go into the mix.
Yeah. So we keep hearing about a government shutdown, and we've been hearing this like year after year for the last couple of years. But then, a few months later, we're back to they fix something, and then a few months later, we're back to government shutdown threats. So why does this keep happening, and what would be the impact of a government shutdown?
It happens because our politics are 100% dysfunctional. And it happens because right now the Republicans have been much more willing to take a scorched earth policy with regard to all of our economic health. So what a government, they have to pass the budget in order to pay the bills for what we've already spent. Okay, so it's an absolute red herring to say that this is a fight about fiscal responsibility. No, that fight came with the budget before we spent the money. This is a fight about whether we're going to pay our bills. And so you might think about it, if you have a couple and they get the visa bill and it's higher than the one likes, it's the same kind of thing that they say, we won't pay that bill. We'll ruin our credit, right? We'll ruin our credit until you give in to what I want you to do. And so a government shutdown, they did just manage to pass this yesterday. They've kicked it out until December 20th, which is no way to run an economy. The impact, if we default, what happens is the government shuts down, okay? Non-essential government workers get furloughed. Essential government workers have to go to work, but they don't get paid until this standoff gets resolved. The longer it goes on, the bigger drag it creates on the economy. So if you think about it, if you own a little restaurant and the lunch crowd usually comes in and there's a government shutdown, and so now those people are at home with their peanut butter and jelly sandwich because they're not getting paid. So that restaurant doesn't get the revenue from the lunch crowd. And that means the workers' hours get cut. And that means that those workers, when they go to buy, school supplies for their child or grandchild going back to work, they spend less. And so it has a negative spiral. It's a multiplier in the economy. A one-day government shutdown is one thing. A month, 6 months, it can push the economy into recession. And the irony is that once the bill is passed, the government goes and back pays all their workers. But you know who doesn't make up for it? The people in the private sector. And you just need to go back and look at the last time Trump drove us over the edge right at the end of the year. And you can see it took what was a growing economy and it created a lot of uncertainty. And the second part of this, so there's the real impact today. The second part of it is, what would happen if we called up Visa and said, I don't feel like paying my credit card bill? That's what we're saying to the world who buys US Treasury bonds, which have been historically the gold standard. We're saying to them, sometimes we don't feel like we're going to pay. And if you are trying to place from a sovereign fund in Norway, right, all the oil money into a safe place, you're going to say, do I want to put all that money in the United States when they are willing to play chicken with defaulting? And it creates this hesitation and distrust on the part of many foreign governments and businesses about maybe they should hedge their bets and not put all that money in the United States. And we have benefited for decades from being the safest place around. We have been able to carry more debt and float it at a lower cost because of our credit worthiness. And so this playing chicken with money we've spent, there is a conversation to be had about what should the spending look like. That should be done before we spend it. There is not a legitimate economic reason to say, should we pay our bills? And it's worse because it's become the default. We are so dysfunctional when it comes to this that we think them passing a 3-month, delay to December 20th is somehow successful governing, because it's asking the very least of them. And so I just don't have any. There is no upside to this. There is no economic benefit that we get.
I kind of like your scoff of like, this is just ridiculous, because it is. And I saw questions in the chat, and yes, I did pass a continuing resolution till December 20th, I think. And the reason we have that is because they can't agree on the budget that would support everything. And so they just have to keep doing like, okay, we'll keep the way it is for 3 months. We'll keep the way it is for 3 months, because they fight over what should go in it. And a lot of times there's some really ugly proposals being put in it that I know the Democrats would never pass. And so that's a little bit of an explanation on that. All right, so we are going to turn away from Congress and budgets and all of that and talk a little bit about immigration. So Trump is proposing that we will just deport 11 million, 15 million, 20 million, I don't remember the exact number, of immigrants in this country. So can you talk a little bit about the economic impact if that plan were to come to fruition?
Yeah, absolutely. I just want to say we have to set aside sort of the moral imperative of the fact that we have in many cases made commitments to the DACA people, and separating families and that sort of thing. So as I talk about this, I'm going to talk about the economic impact, but I just want to acknowledge that there is a huge social cost to what we're doing as well. So best estimates are there might be around 11 million undocumented immigrants in the United States. And it's not at all clear that one could actually deport them all. It fears a lot of the language seems to sort of be designed to create fear, and we're losing our country, et cetera. But if you actually look at the facts, undocumented workers are concentrated in 4 key parts of the economy: agriculture, construction, service, and manufacturing. And in those areas, undocumented immigrants make up somewhere between 10 and 15%. So we're already experiencing food price inflation as a result of the pandemic and climate change and the avian flu and the tail end of the pandemic spending. Now let's take 10 to 15% of the workforce away. And what you have is fewer oranges picked, less grain planted, fewer people working at the poultry processing centers, and that means higher costs, fewer goods and higher costs. You think about construction, and I think we're going to talk a little bit later about sort of the housing market and how that's a little bit frozen up right now, and it's harder for younger people. Well, imagine now we're taking away workers. We're extending the amount of time. You're going to have to pay the workers who are there more, and it's going to take longer. So it's going to exacerbate the problems. Likewise in manufacturing. And so if it could be done, it would really hit 4 industries that we all eat. We all, live and work in places. You know, the service industry, a lot of undocumented immigrants aren't in the visible positions. But as Anthony Bourdain famously said, they're the entire back kitchen office at restaurants. So that's one aspect. Another aspect that I just wanted to point out is undocumented immigrants pay taxes. Okay. And in 2022, it's estimated that all in city, state, federal, they paid about 100 billion with a B. Of that 100 billion, about 26 billion went into Social Security, a program that they cannot access. Those taxes help underwrite the benefits that US citizens draw. They also paid in about 1.9 billion with a B to unemployment. And so they pay into a system that they cannot access and will not benefit from, but we all will benefit from those taxes paid in. When Social Security started, there were about 7 workers for every person who drew it. It's down to about 2 workers for every person who draws it. And although 26 billion is a big number, you know, again, Social Security, but it helps extend the solvency of the program. And so the economic impact of deporting immigrants, undocumented immigrants, is really problematic. I will say there's a conversation to be had, a much broader conversation about our immigration policy. And perhaps we ought to think about allowing in workers legally to meet the needs, because the United States, if you banned immigration, which that has not been a current proposal, but I look at the language around immigrants, I look at the shocking statements about Haitian immigrants in Springfield, Ohio, the state that I'm in. And it reminds me a lot of when the far right, when the Trumpers and the MAGA people were talking about Roe, how, no, we weren't going to come for birth control. We're not going to come for IVF. We're going to make exceptions. And now that it's there, there was that, you know, that unbelievably painful story on the Oprah thing last week, where she was talking about the daughter that died because they were denied health care. And I can't help but wonder if the next step will be not just to look at undocumented workers, but also to try and block people from coming here legally. And about 70% of our growth comes from immigration. And if you want to see what happens to a country that's no longer growing, look at Japan and the absolutely economic stalemate that they have been in for 3 decades because the birth rate is so low. And it has really long-term economic impact. So deporting the undocumented workers, but also the potential for going after legal immigration.
Yeah, somebody actually asked that in the chat, so thank you for covering that. So let's talk about the housing market here for a minute. Why is the housing market so tight for young people, and how do we fix this?
That's a great question. So there are a couple of things going at play. And so when you think about the housing market, part of it is that we had many years of very low interest rates. And so people who bought during that period, and now rates have gone back to normal. Rates are not high. Rates are back to the low end of normal. I know for people under 40, this is high because it's the highest they've seen. But those of us who remember Sally Field from The Flying Nun, you know, many of us paid 8, 10, 12, 14% for our mortgages. And so part of it is people who have these low interest rate loans are hesitant to sell their house and refinance in another home. Now, eventually, job opportunities, retirement, kids moving away, they're going to, you know, relocation, that's going to loosen up. But right now, it's a real tough sell to convince a family looking at their budget that they're going to sell their house with a, you know, 4% mortgage, and they're going to buy something else at, you know, 6.5 or 7%. So that is a short-term thing that will resolve itself with time, but that's part of the immediacy of that. And when you think about what can we do, there are really 2 things that the government can do to kind of ease the housing issue. One is the Harris Walz campaign is suggesting a $25,000, $25,000 down payment for first-time home buyers. And what does that do? Lots of folks can make the monthly payment, but they don't have the savings to do the initial down payment. And so that would help create demand. And it's really no different than, if you're Trump and his parents loaned him, several million to start their business. Well, for those that don't have generational wealth, or those who are younger, or their family isn't in a position to, it lets them begin to get onto the rung of home ownership. So that program would help young people be able to get into that. But what it also helps is those who already own houses who want to sell them, right? Maybe you want to downsize. It helps to spur demand. Folks who are listing their house and they're 7 months into it and they've got no interest. It helps to create demand. So it not only benefits the young people who would have an opportunity to get into home ownership, it also benefits the people who currently have homes and want to maybe move on. So that's the short-term kind of thing. The other thing is longer term. We have a free market. And so we don't have a government that says, we're going to build houses here and you're going to work at this job. We're going to produce so many widgets. So the government doesn't have a role in directly building the houses, but longer term, the government can provide incentives. So what are those incentives? Well, good quality roads, good quality schools and parks and high-speed internet. And if you think about some of the things that the infrastructure bill has done, businesses and families want to be in areas where they have those things. So businesses aren't going to go someplace where they can't get high-speed internet or have good roads to go in and out of the factory. And so the longer term is the government can provide incentives. We do this all the time in all kinds of areas that will incentivize both businesses and people to want to build and live there. And so there's a short-term problem that is resolving. Part of it is just a little bit of time for those who have low interest rates. Part of it is helping young people kind of get on the housing market, and the pandemic really dislocated a lot of those prices. If you own a home, it's been great, but you still need a buyer when you want to move on to whatever you're doing next. And then longer term, roads, parks, schools, high-speed internet, helping local communities with funding to simplify a lot of the regulations around building. Some communities have a minimum lot size, some communities don't allow small houses. There's a lot of thinking that needs to go into executing and changing those things, and the government can support state and local communities in terms of doing that. And so the housing market will resolve, not as quickly as many would like, but it's underway.
I got one question to add to that real quick. So you said that the prices or the interest rate right now is really what the normal interest rates are?
Low of normal.
The low end of normal? Okay, I'm gonna have to break my husband's heart tonight. That's why I'm asking this question. Because we have like a 3.7%. And so he's been waiting for them to go back down. So you're saying that we're probably not going to get too much lower than this?
They are talking about some, depending on the economic data, some continued cuts this fall and into next year. It's all going to be driven on that. But we had those low rates because we were very close to a second Great Depression in 2009. The financial and housing crisis had the economy teetering very close to the Depression. You only see the Federal Reserve put you on 100% oxygen when you're in deep, deep trouble. None of us should want or expect to go back to that. If we do, our economy is in deep, deep trouble. That is not normal. We don't actually want that to come back because it was a signal of a crisis that, lots of people lost their homes, lots of people went bankrupt, a lot of turmoil, a lot of pain. I'm I'm sorry to break his heart, but this is normal. There is some indication they may go a little bit lower. So I don't think we're at the bottom, but are we going to go back to that? God, I hope not.
Julie's getting her personal financials set up here tonight. So I did want to ask one thing that I saw in the chat, and I think it's a good point, and I don't think you said this, but like there's also been, and sorry if you have not looked into this, then just tell me to move on, but the fact that a lot of like apartments and things are being built by venture capitalist funds or large
Oh,
corporations, and it's turning them into Airbnbs. And so like I know my son's rent is like way more than I paid when I was his age. So it's, I mean, granted I'm old, but like still. If you can touch on
yes.
that, then we'll
Oh,
change
absolutely. That is a great point. Whoever suggested or who brought that up, great question. Yes, it's true. That tends to be in certain highly desirable markets. So I live in Akron, Ohio. We're not really having a lot of corporations scoop up housing here for Airbnb. But if I lived in, along the coast, if I lived in very desirable vacation kinds of areas, that can be a big part of what's happening there. It's also that during the pandemic, a lot was purchased by corporations, rents went up, and there is a stickiness like we see in prices in general. It's very rare once a price goes up to ever see it come back down. And so the Airbnbs are a component of it in certain markets. Broadly speaking, it probably is not the key driver in the country as a whole. Best estimates are we're about 3 million housing units short for what we need. And so the real question is, how do we provide incentives without the government going in there and stepping into the private sector? And the way we provide those incentives are what we talked about. Building areas that are desirable, the infrastructure bill, roads, parks, schools, high-speed internet. During the pandemic, it became abundantly clear that rural America was left way behind with internet. That's because it wasn't profitable for businesses to do that. And so the government appropriately steps in to areas where the private sector will not go. And so those kinds of things will help in the long term, providing funding, federal funding to help local and state, sort out those kind of building requirements, which are preventing, making it difficult for builders to build the kinds of housing that young people starting out want. They don't want the big, 3 or 4 bedroom house. And so those are the kinds of things longer term that are going to help address that.
Okay, thank you. We're going to move on from that topic since we've
Okay.
inundated you with questions on that. But this has been asked in the chat, and I think it's really important because I know I'm hearing this and I'm seeing it on social media. So, they have Harris has proposed, obviously, the helping people with the down payment. I think it was $20,000 or $25,000. We're seeing loans of like $50,000 to start a small business. So I see a lot of people saying things like, "Well, how is she going to pay for this?" So
Wow.
I would love an answer and an explanation for like how do these policies that will benefit the economy, how do they actually, how are they funded?
Oh, this is such a great question because economics, which I don't know if you can tell, but I love. Economics is all about making choices, and the choices both in terms of how we spend our money and how we tax the country represent our values for who we are and where we want to go. And so there is a perception that Republicans historically have been better for the economy. That hasn't been true in decades. That goes back to the 1970s. Shout out to my daughter, Sophia. We had this conversation this week when we were stuck in a period of stagflation, which was chronically high inflation and chronically high unemployment. And that was triggered by OPEC in the 1970s. And you might have heard the term stagflation because a few years ago, there was a not insignificant chance that the Federal Reserve was not going to be successful in breaking the back of inflation. And there was concern that we might be entering into another period of that. That concern has now gone. But because of that, They came in with the businessman, right? Reagan rolled in, and we're going to take a businessman's approach. The problem is the government is not a business, right? If all we wanted to do was do for profit, we wouldn't provide high-speed internet. We wouldn't provide medical care to those who couldn't afford it. We wouldn't provide early childhood care and medical care to those who couldn't afford it. We wouldn't provide public education to everybody, right? We have made a decision that as a society, we value these things and we collectively are better. And somehow the Republicans have been able to ride on this perception. But for the past 25 years, the Republicans have demonstrably been worse for the economy. So for example, when Bill Clinton left office, there was no deficit. And those of you who've heard me speak before have heard me say this. In 2003, George W. Bush made a decision to do three things. We went to war, cut taxes, and we expanded prescription drug benefits for seniors. Now, we could have a conversation about all of those things, right? But you cannot go to war and not pay for it and hand the bill to our children. You cannot provide seniors. We could say this is a value. We think seniors who need medication should be able to afford it. Then we have to pay for it. And so the question about how Harris is going to pay for these programs, let me give you a few statistics. Number one, if you are making under $400,000, your taxes are not going up. But if you are making $800,000 or $1 million or $5 million, your taxes are going to go up. Now, this is sometimes trotted out like a boogeyman, like they're going to take all your money. But let me just give you a statistic. Between 2010 and 2018, right? The 400 wealthiest families in the United States, Bill Gates's family, Warren Buffett's family, Elon Musk's family, their average tax rate paid was 8%. That's more than the nurse who's working the night shift. I'm sorry, that's less than the nurse who's working the night shift. That's less than the person who picks up your trash. That's less than your school teacher's going to pay. 8%. Because a lot of their income comes in the form of dividends, and they're able to really play the tax code. And if you hold your stocks and you die with them, you never pay anything on appreciation. So there's a lot of money out there from people who have gamed the system, spoken to power, been able to lobby for benefits that just aren't working for the country. So if they paid 15%, if they paid 20%, if they paid what the average American individual is paying, it'd be a huge boon to the Treasury, and it would cover a lot of those programs. Secondly, and I'm going to try and be brief here, but this is really important because what they're saying just doesn't make sense. As soon as Biden appointed Janet Yellen to be Secretary of the Treasury right after he got into office, she started immediately talking to our allies and our adversaries around the world that we do major trade with. And they have been trying to close the corporate tax loophole where multinational companies shop around for the country that has the lowest tax rate. And what they're proposing is a minimum 15% tax rates for corporations. So in the past, let's take a big multinational, let's take Exxon. And you've heard talk about, oh, let's repatriate profits. Well, Trump talked about doing it once, and it was going to be enough to close the deficit. This is a long-term change that would benefit all of us, all of us. It would give us revenue that rightly should be in the Treasury. It's really just stopping tax dodging. Right now, they can say, oh, the lowest bracket in the world, for quite a while, it was Ireland. And so they would attribute all their earnings to Ireland, and they would just leave them parked there and they wouldn't pay taxes on it. All perfectly legal. So as soon as Biden got in, the Treasury Secretary started to talk to the EU, to Britain, to China, to Japan, to Australia, and say, look, none of us are winning from this game. It's a race to the bottom, right? We just keep cutting, and eventually we're not going to have anything. Can we come to an agreement that a minimum 15% tax If you had a minimum tax rate, what it would mean is there's no incentive for Exxon to go park its money somewhere else. It would come back, and that would be a huge boon to the Treasury. And so the EU has signed on, Great Britain has signed on, China hasn't signed on yet, but there's real reason to believe that it's also in their best interest to do so. So when I think about who I'm voting for, I'm not just voting for what's going to happen in the next month and the next year. This could be a fundamental change. And based on what Trump did with the Trans-Pacific Partnership deal, we had it signed. We were in that agreement. It was this, the Asian countries excluding China. It was a trade deal that gave us a seat at the table, and it was going to help us offset China's growing power. We signed the deal. Those countries trusted us, and he pulled us out of it. And so when I look at this and I think about years of tax revenue and the good that can come out of it, that the benefits to seniors, the benefits to children, the benefits to families, and I have very little reason to believe that if Trump is in office, that this goes forward. And so there is a mechanism to pay for it. Part of it is, 3.5 years underway. Thank you, Janet Yellen and President Biden. But also when you take a look at this idea that we should be underwriting Elon Musk is absurd. I appreciate his innovation, and he's been well compensated for it. But he should not be paying less than the nurse working the night shift. At a minimum, it should be even. And so that's how they're going to pay for the programs. I will also point out that Trump irresponsibly cut taxes in 2017, and everybody's like, oh, I got a tax cut. That blew up the deficit, which meant for a second time, a Republican administration during the good times didn't put anything away for the future. Bush squandered where our strong economic standing, and Trump squandered it. So when the financial crisis and the pandemic came along, we already had a deficit. And when the economy goes into recession, tax revenue drops. And in a crisis, the government spends. Private businesses don't step in there. That is the right role of government. And so the Democrats have consistently been more fiscally responsible in the past 25 years. And so, have that conversation. Which administrations have addressed fairness from taxes? Which ones have simply allowed Elon Musk and Bill Gates and Warren Buffett, who has consistently said, right, he's one of the most successful investors of all times. He's a mentor to Bill Gates. And he has consistently said, I pay less in tax as a percentage than my secretary, and you should tax me more. It will not damage the US economy. There's a real difference from going from 8% to 15 or 20 and going from 8% to 80. It is not going to stop the economy. It is going to provide us revenue to support Social Security, to support these programs, to get some equity and fairness.
Well, we're going to turn to Social Security and Medicare, I believe. I'm making sure I'm following these questions properly. But that is a mic drop that we should not be underwriting Elon Musk. I'm going to take that as the line of the evening. So, so let's talk about that. So what do we need to know about Social Security, Medicare, what's going to happen under Harris versus Trump? And I know everyone's always worried about or hearing about Social Security running out of money. So maybe just touch on the overview of this is a big topic, but what's up with Social Security and Medicare?
It is a big topic. And here's what we need to know. The stronger and more stable and sustainable the economy is, the more the government is going to be able to meet its obligations in all of these programs. And that means we need a fair tax code. We need to not be cutting taxes when we are not going to have offsetting cuts in spending. And so if you're not going to increase prescription drug prices for seniors, then we have to pay for it. And so the Republican mantra of all tax cuts are good tax cuts ignores the fact that those taxes pay for things. And so many of us, we get far more benefit from the services than $100 or $200 tax cut compared to having Social Security be funded and sustainable. And so don't look at what's going to happen to me this month, but step back out and take a look and say, you know, I want a government that is going to consider the needs of all. We can have a conversation about, you know, what's the rate, but there's no world in which billionaires paying 8% and the school bus driver paying more is a fair and just world. And how we spend our money and how we tax reflects our values. And so when I think about Medicare and when I think about Social Security, the key is we need a growing and sustainable economy. And so many of the policies, when I hear people say, you know, Trump's economy was good, it's like saying the grandparents gave the grandkids sugar all day long and the kids were happy. And then when they get returned to their parents, right, they lose their mind. Well, you can juice the economy and you can do these things that have like a short-term benefit, but longer term are really damaging to us. And so if you're concerned about Social Security and you're concerned about Medicare, what you really want is you want a responsible and truthful economic policy, not this, you get a car and you get a car and you don't have to pay taxes. That's a fantasy land. And long after Trump is gone, people are still going to be relying on Social Security and Medicare. And it's incumbent upon all of us to vote, not just for today, but for our future selves and our neighbors and our parents and our children.
Okay. Well, let's switch gears again. Let's talk about student loan debt. Favorite topic. So what's the impact of paying off student loan debt? And what do you say to people who complain that they didn't go to college? So why are they helping others pay off debt?
Julie, I'm so glad you asked this question because I was so moved by what you shared last time we spoke. And I've been thinking about that ever since. And I wanted to circle back and talk about this a little bit. The government, we're only talking about federal loans, right? So we're not talking about private loans. And in general, we're talking about loans that people have paid on 20 or 25 years. The average student loan in this country is just under 40,000, but a quarter of all borrowers owe more than 100,000. And we all know that education, like healthcare, has risen at a much faster pace than other costs in the economy, which means the cost of education and the high price of it is borne disproportionately by the young. And when you look at that, what that means is these are people who are not going to be able to buy a house, who are delaying starting a family, who are making other kinds of choices that restrict what they can do. And it impacts them personally, but it also impacts all of us, right? We talked a little bit about the housing market. If you have people who are carrying a cumbersome amount of student loans and are unable to then buy a house, and you're a homeowner, that's a market that's not there. But I also want to talk about, we make decisions all the time as a country about what we're doing. And let me just give you a scenario. You borrowed money at 18 with probably no financial explanation of what you were signing. You've paid for 20 or 25 years. And many of these loans, you owe as much or more as when you started. Imagine if that were your mortgage and you paid on it for 25 years and you owed more. Instinctively, you know that's not fair. So what's the difference? Well, first of all, we've said mortgage interest is deductible. Student loan interest is not deductible. So we've already made a decision right there to say, we're going to give a break to homeowners. But that 18-year-old who went to college, no, they're going to have to just buckle up and deal with it. Secondly, if you get in over your head with a house, you can declare bankruptcy. If you have a student loan, you can declare bankruptcy, but that student loan stays with you forever. It's difficult to refinance student loans. So during that more than a decade when interest rates were almost at zero, many of these borrowers were being charged rates 5, 6, 7, 8%, and they're paying that to the government. The government is making money off of the loans of these young people. So when I think about this, first of all, a lot of these loans, it's not complete forgiveness. It's been targeted. So we'll forgive 10,000, we'll forgive 20,000. We recognize that if you paid for 25 years and you owe more, something about the way we structured this was unfair and wrong, and we're going to go back and adjust that. And so looking at that, I think that when you free up some of the money that's going to student loans, it frees them to engage in the economy in a different way, to buy houses, to have children, to start families, to do that sort of thing. And this forgiveness, we can have a conversation about, should it be all of the loan? Should it be some of the loan? Should it be, but if the government has been charging people 8% interest when the going interest rate has been 2 or 3%, and they can't deduct it and they can't get out of it, and it's almost impossible to refinance, you just know that's intrinsically unfair. And so I question why we are holding 18-year-olds accountable in a way when they engage in these loans, in a way that we haven't with home buyers, we haven't with corporations who've gotten out too far over their skis in a way, oh, we sailed in there and bailed them out. We bailed out the homeowners. Banks, forgave part of the principal. We do this all the time. And so we provide benefits all the time. And essentially, the system has to be one of fairness. And so I think there's a conversation, if you haven't paid anything and you're in default, okay, that's maybe not a loan. But if you've paid 20 years and haven't missed a payment and you owe more money, there's something wrong with the system. And I think many experts look at the student loan system now and see the faults in it. I think that it is reasonable to address that, and you can engage in it in different ways. But why are we as a country trying to make a profit off of students trying to get an education and better themselves? And I think it's that profit part that really strikes me as problematic.
So I think we're almost at time. What I know, a lot of people are still on, so we're not losing people because this is a very important topic. I'm going to drop, I just want you all to know, so the Momonomics campaign, we have put out a one-page, like, how to have a conversation about the economy guide. You can also go to our Momonomics page on our website, which our website is redwine.blue, and you can find Momonomics under campaigns. We have lots of explainers and information. So I'm going to drop a link to our convo guide, like how to do this. So what we are asking everyone to do tonight is to get that, read that, and please start talking to your friends about the economy. Send them to the Momonomics page. Send them a copy of this video. Shireen is going to be doing little videos. You'll be able to find her explaining things. Share those with your friends. Heather Cox-Richardson just did a great post not that long ago about like the history of like Republican versus Democrats in terms of the economy and kind of how we got here. But anyways, last question, and I think this is kind of summing it all up for people. I'm going to make sure I read it properly here. What would you, Shireen, say to someone who said that they're supporting Trump because of the economy, or like, well, I was better off 4 years ago? Like, just that we all hear that.
Yeah,
Trump's
it's a great question.
What would you say to somebody who said that to you?
Well, if they've already decided, I would walk away. But that group in the middle that you can have a conversation with, I think what I would point out is that when people say how great the Trump administration was, they stop it before the pandemic. And that's like saying, oh, you know what? My child was in a car accident, but they drove really well right before they totaled the family car, right? Like, he owns the whole part of his administration. You don't get just to cherry pick and say, this part was great. In retrospect, it's clear the pandemic at the beginning was woefully mishandled, and he has to own that. That is also part of what his legacy is. He doesn't just get to pick the high point and say the rest of it didn't happen. Secondly, when you talk about the tax cut. That tax cut was irresponsible. It was billed as a way to stimulate the economy, right? Businesses were going to hire. Interest rates had been at zero for nearly a decade. If you were a CFO of a company and you didn't expand when you could borrow at almost nothing, you'd be fired. And so there was not going to be any stimulative effect from the corporations. And with the benefit of hindsight, we can see that it did not cause corporations to hire because they were already sitting on loads of cash, right? It did not cause that. But what it did cause is it caused a giant deficit expansion. And that deficit makes it harder for us to fund Social Security for the long term, fund programs that are important. It put us back on our heels when the crisis of the pandemic came because we were coming into it already overextended. And so when I think about what makes for good policy, we don't live our lives in a 4-year increment. And so if it's great under Trump, but the legacy of his decisions leaves us with a giant deficit, 1 million of our citizens died during that. We've pulled out of agreements with our partners that we had agreed to. It's made a tax cut for corporations who already pay a low rate permanent, and it's made the tax cut for individuals, you and I, temporary. Oh, it's crystal clear where the values lie. I would also say that when they talk about, gas is so expensive, well, that's because nobody was driving. It's a supply and demand issue. In 2021, if I put on 500 miles in my car in that year, I'd be astonished. And I usually do that in a week. And so to point to low gas prices like that, that was a signal of a crisis, not a smart economic move. It's like those super low interest rates. That's a signal of an economy in crisis, not of a great economy. And so what I would say to people who are looking at Trump is I would say, look at his policies in totality. Maybe you got a $200 tax cut, but the deficit exploded. Are you concerned about your mom's Social Security? Are you concerned about the cost of your child's education? Do you think that for homeowners, we want to get young people to be able to buy? That means that we have to be responsible, and that means the government needs revenue. And I think that Elon Musk can pay his fair share. I think that Trump knows how to juice things in the short term. It's no surprise the tax cut for us as individuals goes away next year. He figured it would go away at the end of his second term. It was all about him, as are all of the economic choices he made. Benefit his cronies, benefit people, Americans who are working, not concerned about their Social Security, he's going to be fine, not concerned about Medicare, not concerned about working families, not concerned about children's education, not concerned about early childhood, not concerned about the child tax credit, not concerned about any of it. And that's why Harris is unquestionably, in my mind, better than Trump for the economy, because we're not living in a 1-year time frame. We're living decades. And we're not looking at one issue, my tax rate. Well, if you pay $200 more in taxes, but you're getting $10,000 in benefit because the government is focusing on programs that are going to help the middle class, you're better off. And that's why Harris is the better economic choice.
Well, Shireen, thank you so much. Again, I think a lot of love in the chat and everyone just saying that they really appreciate all the information. I know I've learned so much while listening tonight, Julie. I'm sure you have too. So, and your husband is about to.
That too.
Sorry about that. Well, thank you
Yeah.
so much. I appreciate all of you staying with me. Sometimes this is dry material, but it's really about the kind of country that we're going to have and what our values are, and making our values visible through the budget and how the tax code is written. And it's a critical time. We could be in such a good place in a few years if some of these things that have been started are allowed to continue. it could be transformative.
Well, we appreciate your time. And like I said, we expect to have more Shereen everywhere. So look for her videos. We'll probably cut down some of this even and turn it into content. So please check for that. And again, I'm going to drop in the chat. Everybody, please get the explainer. This is your call to action. No matter what you're doing, we'd love you to come tomorrow at noon or Monday and meet Ron and get on Raleigh Your Squad, because we want you to be talking to your friends, and Raleigh helps you do that. But at the very least, please download this explainer and please go out there and start talking to your friends about this. Everyone
Can
have
I
a
add
good
one thing?
Yeah.
Can I add one thing? Sophia, would you put the website in the chat? There is this, it's kind of a simplistic thing, but it's called fiscalship.org. It's a nonprofit, and it lets you put in the priorities of the two candidates and see the impact. And so it's a simple, easy to use tool. But if you wanted to see what the impact on the deficit would be, et cetera, if you go to fiscal, FISCAL, ship, SHIP.org, it's a good little tool to sort of see what the economic impacts would be of the different policies that are being proposed.
Everybody, thank you for hanging in. I know we're over time. Have a great evening. Bye,
Thank you.
everybody.
Bye.